Catherine II, born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst on the 2nd of May, 1729, most commonly known as Catherine the Great, was the last reigning Empress Regnant of Russia from 1762 until 1796, and the country's longest ruling female leader. She came to power following the overthrow of her husband and second cousin, Peter III. Under her reign, Russia grew larger, its culture was revitalized, and it was recognized as one of the great powers of Europe. In her accession to power and her rule of the empire, Catherine often relied on her noble favorites, most notably Count Grigory Orlov and Grigory Potemkin. Assisted by highly successful generals such as Alexander Suvorov and Pyotr Rumyantsev, and admirals such as Samuel Gregg and Fyodor Ushakov, she governed at a time when the Russian Empire was expanding rapidly by conquest and diplomacy. In the south, the Crimean Khanate was crushed following victories over the Bar Confederation and Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish War in 1768 to 1774, with the support of the United Kingdom, and Russia colonized the territories of Novorossiya along the coasts of the Black and Azov Seas. In the west, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, ruled by Catherine's former lover, King Stanislaus Augustus Poniatowski, was eventually partitioned, with the Russian Empire gaining the largest share. In the east, Russians became the first Europeans to colonize Alaska, establishing Russian America. Catherine reformed the administration of Russian gubernias, governorates, and many new cities and towns were founded on her orders, most notably Odessa, Dnipro, Kherson, Mykolaiv, and Sevastopol. An admirer of Peter the Great, Catherine continued to modernize Russia along Western European lines. However, military conscription and the economy continued to depend on serfdom, and the increasing demands of the state and of private landowners intensified the exploitation of serf labor. This was one of the chief reasons behind rebellions, including the large-scale Pugachev rebellion of Cossacks, nomads, peoples of Volga, and peasants. The period of Catherine the Great's rule, the Catherinian era, is considered a golden age of Russia. The Manifesto on Freedom of the Nobility, issued during the short reign of Peter III and confirmed by Catherine, freed Russian nobles from compulsory military or state service. Constructions of many mansions of the nobility, in the classical style endorsed by the Empress, changed the face of the country. She enthusiastically supported the ideals of the Enlightenment, and is often included in the ranks of the enlightened despots. As a patron of the arts, she presided over the age of the Russian Enlightenment, including the establishment of the Smolny Institute of Noble Maidens, the first state-financed higher education institute for women in Europe. Early life. Catherine was born in Stettin, Pomerania, Kingdom of Prussia, now Szczecin, Poland, as Princess Sophie Friederike Auguste von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg. Her mother was Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp. Her father, Christian August, Prince of Anhalt-Zerbst, belonged to the ruling German family of Anhalt. He tried to become the Duke of Duchy of Kurland and Semigalia, but in vain, and at the time of his daughter's birth held the rank of a Prussian general in his capacity as governor of the city of Stettin. But because her second cousin, Peter III, converted to Orthodox Christianity, two of her first cousins became kings of Sweden, Gustav III and Charles VIII. In accordance with the custom then prevailing in the ruling dynasties of Germany, she received her education chiefly from a French governess and from tutors. According to her memoirs, Sophie was regarded as a tomboy and trained herself to master a sword. Sophie's childhood was very uneventful. She once wrote to her correspondent, Baron Grimm, "I see nothing of interest in it." Although Sophie was born a princess, her family had very little money. Her rise to power was supported by her mother Joanna's wealthy relatives, who were both nobles and royal relations. Her mother's brother became the heir to the Swedish throne after her second cousin Peter III converted to Orthodoxy. The more than 300 sovereign entities of the Holy Roman Empire, many of them quite small and powerless, made for a highly competitive political system, as the various princely families fought for advantage over each other, often via political marriages. For the smaller German princely families, an advantageous marriage was one of the best means of advancing their interests, and young Sophie was groomed throughout her childhood to be the wife of some powerful ruler in order to improve the position of the reigning house of Anhalt. Besides her native German, Sophie became fluent in French, the lingua franca of European elites in the 18th century. The young Sophie received the standard education for an 18th century princess, with a concentration upon learning the etiquette expected of a lady, French, and Lutheran theology. Sophie first met her future husband, who had become Peter III of Russia, at the age of 10. Peter was her second cousin. Based on her writings, she found Peter detestable upon meeting him. She disliked his pale complexion and his fondness for alcohol at such a young age. Peter also still played with toy soldiers. She later wrote that she stayed at one end of the castle and Peter at the other. Marriage, reign of Peter III, and coup d'etat. The choice of Princess Sophie as wife of the future Tsar was one result of the Lopukhina conspiracy, in which Count Lestock and Prussian King Frederick the Great took an active part. The object was to strengthen the friendship between Prussia and Russia, to weaken the influence of Austria, and to ruin the Chancellor Alexei Petrovich Bestusev-Ryumin, on whom Russian Empress Elizabeth relied, and who was a known partisan of the Austrian alliance. The diplomatic intrigue failed, largely due to the intervention of Sophie's mother, Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp. Historical accounts portray Johanna as a cold, abusive woman who loved gossip and court intrigues. Her hunger for fame centered on her daughter's prospects of becoming Empress of Russia, but she infuriated Empress Elizabeth, who eventually banned her from the country for spying for King Frederick II of Prussia. Empress Elizabeth knew the family well. She had intended to marry Princess Johanna's brother, Charles Augustus, Karl August von Holstein, but he died of smallpox in 1727 before the wedding could take place. Despite Johanna's interference, Empress Elizabeth took a strong liking to Sophie, and her marriage to Peter eventually took place in 1745. When Sophie arrived in Russia in 1744, she spared no effort to ingratiate herself not only with Empress Elizabeth, but with her husband and with the Russian people as well. She applied herself to learning the Russian language with zeal, rising at night and walking about her bedroom barefoot, repeating her lessons. When she wrote her memoirs, she said she made the decision then to do whatever was necessary and to profess to believe whatever was required of her to become qualified to wear the crown. Although she mastered the language, she retained an accent. Sophie recalled in her memoirs that as soon as she arrived in Russia, she fell ill with a pleurisy that almost killed her. She credited her survival to frequent bloodletting. In a single day she had 4 phlebotomies. Her mother's opposition to this practice brought her the emperor's disfavor. When Sophie's situation looked desperate, her mother wanted her confessed by a Lutheran pastor. Awakening from her delirium, however, Sophie said, "I don't want any Lutheran, I want my Orthodox father." This raised her in the empress's esteem. Princess Sophie's father, a devout German Lutheran, opposed his daughter's conversion to Eastern Orthodoxy. Despite his objections, on the 28th of June 1744, the Russian Orthodox Church received Princess Sophie as a member with the new name Catherine, Yekaterina or Ekaterina, and the artificial patronym Alexeyevna, daughter of Alexei, so that she was in all respects the namesake of Catherine I, the mother of Elizabeth and the grandmother of Peter III. On the following day, the formal betrothal of Catherine and Peter took place, and the long-planned dynastic marriage finally occurred on the 21st of August 1745 in St. Petersburg. Sophie had turned 16. Her father did not travel to Russia for the wedding. The bridegroom, known as Peter von Holstein-Gottorp, had become Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, located in the northwest of present-day Germany, near the border with Denmark, in 1739. The newlyweds settled in the palace of Oranienbaum, which remained the residence of the young court for many years. From there they governed the duchy, which occupied less than a third of the current German state of Schleswig-Holstein, even including that part of Schleswig occupied by Denmark, to obtain experience to govern Russia. Apart from providing that experience, the marriage was unsuccessful. It was not consummated for years due to Peter III's mental immaturity. After Peter took a mistress, Catherine became involved with other prominent court figures. She soon became popular with several powerful political groups that opposed her husband. Bored with her husband, Catherine became an avid reader of books, mostly in French. She disparaged her husband for his devotion to reading, on the one hand Lutheran prayer books, the other the history of and trial of some highway robbers who had been hanged or broken on the wheel. It was during this period that she first read Voltaire and other philosophers of the French Enlightenment. As she learned Russian, she became increasingly interested in the literature of her adopted country. Finally, it was the Annals by Tacitus that caused what she called a revolution in her teenage mind, as Tacitus was the first intellectual she read who understood power politics as they are, not as they should be. She was especially impressed with his argument that people do not act for their professed idealistic reasons, and instead she learned to look for the hidden and interested motives. According to Alexander Herzen, who edited a version of Catherine's memoirs, Catherine had her first sexual relationship with Sergei Saltykov while living at Oranienbaum, as her marriage to Peter had not been consummated, as Catherine later claimed. But Catherine left to Paul first the final version of her memoirs, explaining why Paul had been the son of Peter III. Sergei Saltykov was used to make Peter jealous, and relations with Saltykov were platonic. Catherine wanted to become an empress herself and did not want another heir to the throne. But Empress Elizabeth blackmailed Peter and Catherine that they both had been involved into a plot of Russian military in 1749 to execute the will of Catherine III first and to crown Peter together with Catherine. Elizabeth requested her legal heir from Catherine. Only when a new legal heir, the son of Catherine and Peter, survived and appeared to be strong, had Elizabeth allowed Catherine to have real sexual lovers, because Elizabeth probably wanted to leave both Catherine and her accomplice Peter III without any rights for a Russian throne, in revenge for the participation of the pair in military plots to have themselves crowned in her stead. After this, over the years, Catherine carried on sexual liaisons with many men, including Stanislaus Augustus Poniatowski, Grigory Grigorovich Orlov, Alexander Vasilchikov, Grigory Potemkin, and others. She became friends with Princess Ekaterina Vorontsova-Dashkova, the sister of her husband's official mistress, who in Dashkov's opinion introduced her to several powerful political groups that opposed her husband, though Catherine had been involved in military schemes against Elizabeth, probably to get rid of Peter III at the next stage, at least since 1749. Peter III's temperament became quite unbearable for those who resided in the palace. He would announce trying drills in the morning to male servants, who later joined Catherine in her room to sing and dance until late hours. In 1759, Catherine became pregnant with her second child, Anna, who only lived to 14 months. Due to various rumors of Catherine's promiscuity, Peter was led to believe he was not the child's biological father, and is known to have proclaimed, "Go to the devil," when Catherine angrily dismissed his accusations. She thus spent much of this time alone in her private boudoir, to hide away from Peter's abrasive personality. In her first version of her memoirs, edited and published by Alexander Herzen, Catherine strongly implied that the real father of her son Paul was not Peter but rather Saltykov. Catherine recalled in her memoirs her optimistic and resolute mood before her ascension to the throne. "I used to say to myself that happiness and misery depend on ourselves. If you feel unhappy, raise yourself above unhappiness, and so act that your happiness may be independent of all eventualities." After the death of the Empress Elizabeth on the 5th of January 1762, Peter succeeded to the throne as Emperor Peter III, and Catherine became Empress Consort. The imperial couple moved into the new Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The emperor's eccentricities and policies, including a great admiration for the Prussian king Frederick II, alienated the same groups that Catherine had cultivated. Russia and Prussia had fought each other during the 7 Years' War in 1756 to 1763, and Russian troops had occupied Berlin in 1761. Peter, however, supported Frederick II, eroding much of his support among the nobility. Peter seized Russian operations against Prussia, and Frederick suggested the partition of Polish territories with Russia. Peter also intervened in a dispute between his Duchy of Holstein and Denmark over the province of Schleswig. As Duke of Holstein-Gottorp, Peter planned war against Denmark, Russia's traditional ally against Sweden. In July 1762, barely 6 months after becoming emperor, Peter lingered in Orienbaum with his Holstein-born courtiers and relatives, while his wife lived in another palace nearby. On the night of July the 8th, 1762, Catherine the Great was given the news that one of her co-conspirators has been arrested by her estranged husband, and that all they had been planning must take place at once. The next day she left the palace and departed for the Ismailovsky regiment, where she delivered a speech asking the soldiers to protect her from her husband. Catherine then left with the regiment to go to the Semenovsky barracks, where the clergy was waiting to ordain her as the sole occupant of the Russian throne. She had her husband arrested and forced him to sign a document of abdication, leaving no one to dispute her accession to the throne. On the 17th of July 1762, 8 days after the coup that amazed the outside world, and just 6 months after his accession to the throne, Peter III died at Ropsha, possibly at the hands of Alexei Orlov, younger brother to Grigory Orlov, then a court favorite and a participant in the coup. Peter supposedly was assassinated, but it is unknown how he died. The official cause after an autopsy was a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplexy stroke. At the time of Peter III's overthrow, other potential rivals for the throne included Ivan VI, 1740 to 1764, who had been confined at Schlüsselburg in Lake Ladoga from the age of 6 months and was thought to be insane. Ivan VI was assassinated during an attempt to free him as part of a failed coup. Like Empress Elizabeth before her, Catherine had given strict instructions that Ivan was to be killed in the event of any such attempt. Yelizaveta Alexeyevna Tarakhanovna, 1753 to 1775, was another potential rival. Although Catherine did not descend from the Romanov dynasty, her ancestors included members of the Rurik dynasty, which preceded the Romanovs. She succeeded her husband as Empress Regnant, following the precedent established when Catherine I succeeded her husband Peter the Great in 1725. Historians debate Catherine's technical status, whether as a regent or as a usurper, tolerable only during the minority of her son, Grand Duke Paul. Reign 1762 to 1796. Coronation. Catherine was crowned at the Assumption Cathedral in Moscow on the 22nd of September 1762. Her coronation marks the creation of one of the main treasures of the Romanov dynasty, the Imperial crown of Russia. Designed by Swiss-French court diamond jeweler Jérémie Posy. Inspired by the Byzantine Empire design, the crown was constructed of 2 half spheres, one gold and one silver, representing the Eastern and Western Roman empires, divided by a foliate garland and fastened with a low hoop. The crown contains 75 pearls and 4,936 Indian diamonds, forming laurel and oak leaves, the symbols of power and strength, and is surmounted by 398-carat ruby spinel that previously belonged to the Empress Elizabeth, and a diamond cross. The crown was produced in a record 2 months and weighed 2.3 kilograms. From 1762, the Great Imperial Crown was the coronation crown of all Romanov emperors until the monarchy's abolition in 1917. It is one of the main treasures of the Romanov dynasty and is now on display in the Moscow Kremlin Armory Museum.